Today I'm with Dr. Adam James Smith and we're going to be talking all about the 18th century. So Adam taught me as an undergraduate and you're an 18th century academic. Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
So I'm a lecturer at York St John, which is where I first taught Claire.
Favourite student.
Yeah, well the only student I've had that went on to become an internet celebrity so far. Although there's a few budding celebrities. There's actually, I take that back.
Yeah.
But you were the first to have...
Yeah, I set the trend.
Oh yeah, Claire was a very, very diligent, good citizen, very sweet student, and I had no idea you had 12,000 followers on YouTube. But generally I work on the 18th century. So I work on 18th century political periodicals mostly. I'm interested in the relationship between the citizen and the state and how that's articulated through literature and through print. So my PhD, which I finished in 2014, was all about periodicals and magazines printed in the early 18th century that were paid for by political parties but didn't actually say so.
Right.
And then subsequently I've been looking at expressions of political identity outside of London, and I've actually been spending a lot of time looking at really angry radical newspapers printed in 18th century Sheffield.
So is that linked to the book that you've edited?
Yes, so last year a colleague of mine, Dr. Hamish Matheson at the University of Sheffield, and I got a modest sum of money to try and do something with this work to get it out in the community, and we produced a book which was published by a small avant-garde company called Spirit-Duplicator.
I'll put a link down below.
Fantastic. Yeah, so it was like 10 very angry poems printed in Sheffield newspapers, which are terrifyingly prescient today.
Yeah, and it's also beautifully designed as well. That's just like an aesthetic point, that's not an academic point at all, but it is, I think it's definitely worth checking out because it's beautifully designed, and if you're interested in political literature then it's a really great way to get into 18th century political literature.
Thanks, Claire.
Yeah. Most of you probably know that I'm doing an MA in English Literary Studies. Majority of my studying has actually been the 18th century, which is why we're having this talk today, but my dissertation is on 1840s writing, which isn't the 18th century in my mind, but in my MA, the 18th century at York goes from 1650 to 1850, and so I thought we could talk about what the 18th century is, if that's counted as the 18th century in some places.
So the 18th century is 1700 to 1799, like that is an objective fact. Although something you constantly come up against if you're studying or researching literature is periodization, which period you're going to look at on a certain research project, or if you're designing a module, which period you're going to teach. This is also how anthologies work. And it's a necessary evil. I used to have a lecturer when I was an undergraduate student who used to refer to anthologies as organised violence.
Right.
Because they take texts out of their context, and they smash them together, and they force them into
it's
order.
Weird.
So with the 18th century, we have to decide. And not everybody agrees, or for various different reasons, people look at different periods in certain contexts. So for me, and the work that I've done, we refer to the long 18th century, which I tend to think of being the Glorious Revolution.
So it's 1688?
Which is 1688,
Yay,
absolutely, 1688, all the way up to the French Revolution. We've got the Glorious Revolution, which I think a lot of the issues that were coming out of the Civil War come to a head, and then you've got the French Revolution, American Revolution, and real questions about, again, the relationship between the citizen and the state come back. But that's a nice little bookend. You
then have the argument of, one I find a lot is, where is Jane Austen? Where does Jane Austen fit? For me, Jane Austen is an 18th century writer. It
depends what conversation you're having. So,
that's true, actually.
If you're thinking about it as kind of like, if you're thinking of Jane Austen and the kind of like style and influences, then you could probably argue it both ways. But I certainly see her as a kind of like sequel to Frances Burney and that kind of 18th century writing. But if you're talking about the form of the novel, or if you're talking about epistolary fiction, or you're talking about style, there's very different ways you can categorise it. But she's an 18th century when it's useful for it to be. Yeah,
I think in my life she always...
I'm quite happy when she's grouped in the 19th century. Because if you go to 18th century conferences and there's a panel on Jane Austen, you can guarantee that if you're up against that, your audience will be much smaller because everyone will be watching Jane Austen.
So you're happy to kind of let them move along. I asked some of you some questions, and one of the main one was, what are our favourite 18th century texts and where to start with 18th century literature?
One of my favourite 18th century texts is also a good gateway drug if you're trying to get into the 18th century. And it's a novella, so it's quite short as well, which is always nice when you're looking at 18th century texts.
And like door stoppers.
It's just called Phantomina by a writer called Eliza Haywood. So it's a woman writer. It's the second half of the 18th century. And it's excellent. All of the themes that I think are really interesting about the 18th century, questions of capitalism and commerce and excess and disguise and authenticity and performativity and the theatre and and what's polite and what's good and what's bad, and if you live in a 24-hour society where you can buy anything, questions of like what that does to your morality, ethics. It's generically really interesting because it was presented as being a conduct book.
Yeah.
So if you're a young girl living in the 18th century, buy this book and it'll show you how to behave. But then it's got these really, quite titillating scenes, and it's much closer to erotica.
Yeah, definitely.
That's not what I like. Well, that's not the only reason I like it, but that is something.
That's the reason I like it. I'm just going straight up.
It's this young woman of, she's quite high class. Woman of virtue, goes to the theatre, sees this guy that she's fancied. Look, I can't remember his name, Lord. So he's got a French name, but this Lord that she fancies, and she sees him flirting to the prostitutes and thinks, "Wow, I wish he'd speak to me like that. He's always so courteous and polite around me."
Way to get a man.
Yeah, so she decides to go home and come back dressed as a prostitute, and like inexplicably rent a second house and take him back to. And they go back there and have a night of passion. Yeah. And then she realises the next day that she's done that and her virtue's in store because she didn't do it as herself.
Yes.
So she keeps doing it until he gets bored of sleeping with her because he has a roving eye. So he goes off to the country, and then when he gets there he meets this beautiful country maid who just also happens to be our character again. Yeah. And then it turns out that like the next 10 women he sleeps with are all this character. We never find out her name, but her first pseudonym is Phantomina, so people tend to refer to her as Phantomina. And it doesn't end well for her, but there's quite a lot of fun to be had in the middle.
I studied that as an undergraduate, and that was one of my favourites as well. I think
it's something we've talked about before. I don't know what kind of currency the 18th century has outside of scholarship, the academy, or various people who are fans of it. But I imagine that people think that because it's old, because it's like old literature and it's written in old type, that it's going to be quite dry or stale or boring.
Yeah, I think that's perception.
But the 18th century is filthy.
Yeah, completely. And bawdy,
filthy, sweary, irreverent.
Yes.
I mean, you've got the extremes. You've got Samuel Richardson, who's quite pious and conservative, but then you do have these texts which are constantly challenging that. And one of the reasons I come back to the 18th century again is because it's really funny.
Yeah.
Like, it's really funny.
My favourite text, I think, is Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne. And I don't want to give like a little synopsis because I feel like it's Tristram Shandy and I can never really do that. But I feel like if you like fragmented narratives that have lots of digressions, a chapter on noses, maybe a chapter on buttons, lots of blank pages, random squiggles, just kind of lots of nonsense. It's a cock and bull story. It is wonderful, isn't it? I mean, but how do you describe it? Except that it's just this random... Yeah. Like, it's bullshit. Literally, that's what it says at the end. Like, it's completely bullshit.
I always describe it to students as being, it's a man's attempt to write his own life. Yes. But he can't decide where to start. Yeah. And he never decides. No. Does he?
I think even at the beginning, because it begins technically, like, I guess... not in a sexy, but its own conception, which I just think is wonderful. Yeah. And that's rude as well. I mean, you've got so many like phallic symbols and just weird, and the nose, and it made me so happy as an undergraduate.
A friend of mine, Helen Williams at the University of Northumbria, works on Sterne.
Oh, right.
And I once saw her do a paper at a conference about apparently, because in the first scene of the book, Tristram Shandy is explaining why he's not the best man ever, because his parents weren't thinking about what they were doing when they begot him. Yeah. Because just as they're about to
is it the clock?
Yeah,
I love it so much.
Yeah, just as they're about to climax, his soon-to-be mother asks his soon-to-be father if he's wound up the clock. And Helen's paper was all about how this suddenly became a euphemism. Yeah. Apparently, if you were in a polite social situation, you saw someone that you wanted to hook up with, like wind up your watch or wind up your clock, was basically an 18th century Tinder.
Really?
Like, according to these like pamphlets that she's looking at. So again, it will be parody and it's a joke. It's not necessarily the reality of the situation. But wind up your watch became,
love that,
in a kind of like jokey way, a way of showing that you were up for it.
Ah,
it's the 18th century, everyone.
I mean, I would always say to people, start with Jane Austen. Arguably, is she 18th century? In my mind, she is. Just because it was where I started, in fact, just reading classic literature when I was young. And I think Jane Austen is a writer you can just return to and read lots of kind of critics around and just have a different experience. I think Jane Austen is kind of put to the side sometimes, even though, well, she's not put aside, she's talked about it a lot, but I think she's kind of talked about in a way that I still find quite sexist, because it's seen as like, even though it's classic literature, sometimes it's seen as lesser literature, like with period dramas being seen as a lesser form. They're female-centred and they're seen as not being good enough. And so even though Jane Austen's talked about, I'm still like, go and read some Jane Austen. But also start with the people before Jane Austen that inspired Jane Austen. So go and read Frances Burney and Evelina, which is one of my favourite novels. and also Anne Radcliffe, which also inspired Northanger Abbey.
Yeah. I mean, one way of getting a good sense of the 18th century is to trace the rise of the novel. So at the end of that, as you get into the 19th century, you've got Jane Austen. She's building on generations of experiment and development. I noticed that a lot of your followers are a bit against Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe.
And I
it's
it starts in York, doesn't it? He's born in York, isn't he?
Yeah.
That's the one good thing I have about that novel.
It's one of the first. Well, 18th century's claim, and a lot of scholarship claims that it's one of the first British novels. Although it depends on your definition, and you've got longer prose fiction in the 17th and 16th century. And I've got colleagues at the Sheffield Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies of the Bible who talk about ancient novels, which are like pre-0 AD. So there are other examples, but in the English form, as we use the term today, it's one of the first. And Daniel Defoe is a bit of a hack writer. He was he was a kind of journalist, but print culture is quite new. And he was writing things that he thought would sell. And one of the interesting things about Robinson Crusoe is the generic instability. If we see it as a novel now, it's hard to imagine how that would have been read on if you just picked it off a newsstand next to pamphlets and newspapers and things. But what worked with readers, he did more of. So it's kind of, it's a story that culminates in Daniel Defoe holding a gun to a bear and telling the bear to dance, which is brilliant, I think.
How can you hate a novel that does that?
That's right, how can you hate a novel with a dancing bear? And then, I've already mentioned Samuel Richardson and his books of virtuous letters, and then Henry Fielding comes along and starts making fun of Samuel Richardson. So I think, another text that your readers were not so keen on was Pamela. Global bestseller. There was operas written about it. Like if you go to the V&A, they've got teapots with Pamela on.
I haven't been to the V&A yet. I really want to go.
Well, check out the 18th century merchandise for Pamela. But any feelings that, oh gosh, this is a little bit pious, this is overly virtuous, this is a bit boring, this is taking too long. Also feelings that people had in the 18th century. And then Henry Fielding comes along and writes Shamala, which is a parody.
I need to read that now.
Pamela's a book of letters, it's an epistolary novel, and the conceit of Shamala is these are the letters that you didn't see, these are the letters that she didn't write to her dad or a guardian or whatever. And you find out that she gets up to all kinds of mischief. There's one of the things that comes out of the 18th century novel is this device called writing to the moment. You'll be saying things like, I'm at the party now, to her best friend, but she can't possibly, because when is she writing a letter? And Henry Fielding turns this into a joke where she's writing to someone as her lover comes into the bedroom and starts to have sex with her while she's writing the letter.
This is when you need to read the 18th century.
Yeah, and then of course, just as the novel becomes fairly stable, Tristram Shandy comes along and it's like a diagnostic, deconstructive parody of every facet of novel. The things that Tristram Shandy's making fun of never go away. You can read it as a parody of a 21st century novel.
Definitely, I would agree. I think because, like you're saying before, it's never not relevant. Like the 18th century hasn't just finished. At the dawn of the 19th century, we're constantly going back to it, and it's relevant in everyday society. And a lot of your research is to do with obviously politics, and that's really relevant now. And this is a quick little reminder to go and register to vote if you haven't already done that.
So a question I get asked a lot is, why have you decided to spend so much time working in the 18th century? And it's because I think for me, there's something recognisably modern about the 18th century. You've got suddenly through to the rise of capitalism, things like street lamps. The invention of street lamps meant that people could stay out after bedtime for the first time, and with that and with the expansions of empire, suddenly things become more affordable, society becomes ever so slightly more accessible. I'm hesitant to go, I think it's easy to think of suddenly the 18th century starts and everyone's in the assembly rooms and the coffee houses. They're not, but more people than before. And more people than before are buying things, and with the explosion of cheap print, more people than before are buying printed material. And writing printed material. And what it means is that previous to the 18th century, previous to the long 18th century, what literature was getting made, or what art was getting made, was determined by what the palace wanted, what kings and their courts, and what people, and through patronage. But as soon as people could start buying it themselves, then what gets produced is what people bought, which was a source of absolute horror for people like Alexander Pope. He thought that society was going to devolve into just celebrity gossip and tat. And he had a point, I suppose. But there's also something kind of increasingly egalitarian about it. And then you've got writers like Joseph Addison, who I work on, who I did my PhD on, who I'm working on and writing a monograph about at the moment. And his whole shtick is that, society has become more accessible, and with that comes a responsibility and a duty. If you are more informed and you are more engaged, then you have to make sure that you use your vote, that you use your right, that you keep on top of things, and that you're an active member of society. That's my research, and also I'm very emphatic about how people should be involved in politics now more than ever.
Yeah, I agree. So if people want to know more about the 18th century, where do they go? What do they do?
Well, there's lots of places they could go. Although, I mean, if you're interested in the things that I've been talking about,
follow Adam.
You can follow me on Twitter @ElementalAdam. And there's a link there to my own website where you could read more about my research. And the whole premise of my website is that it's kind of like a comment on current events from the perspective of the 18th century. So Dr. Kaylee Kramer, who's a resident 18th centuryist,
she taught me as an underground, and she's amazing. She's the reason I study 18th century now, really.
Yeah, and I'm an all-purpose lecturer at York St John, but Kaylee is our resident 18th century specialist. You can follow Kaylee on Twitter as well. And Kaylee and I both curate a Twitter profile which is all about 18th century York. Then I guess you're from the Centre for 18th Century Studies, which you can also follow on Twitter.
You can indeed.
And if you want to read any of the things we've mentioned, you can access it all freely online via Project Gutenberg as well. So there's a whole world to discover. And if all of that isn't enough 18th century for you,
it's never enough.
There's the British Society for 18th Century Studies, which is an academic society that, again, you can follow on Twitter. But part of that is a kind of like a sub-website called Critics, which is where we review anything to do with the 18th century that isn't an academic textbook. And I'm the co-editor for the media section, so if you want recommendations of programmes set in the 18th century or plays or any kind of popular culture that's engaged with the 18th century, we've reviewed it. So you can read our reviews and also get a good idea of things to be watching.
Thank you, Adam, for being in my video and talking about the 18th century with me. I will put all of the links in the description below to all your websites and to the book. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Claire.
You're welcome.
Thanks for asking me. That was really pleasant. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too.